The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Windsor Castle's quadrangle as Catherine Morrison, the Queen's private secretary, checked her watch for the third time in 5 minutes. It was June 13th, 2021, and today would be unlike any other day in the castle's thousand-year history. President Joe Biden, the 46th President of the United States, was coming to tea with Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, and everyone from the kitchen staff to the royal protection officers could feel the electricity in the air. Catherine had been working for the royal household for 15 years, but she had never seen preparations quite like these. The Queen herself had been involved in every detail, from the selection of china to the precise timing of the motorcade's arrival. This wasn't just another diplomatic meeting. This was personal. "Ma'am, the advance team from the White House has completed their final security sweep," announced Chief Inspector David Matthews, the head of the Queen's security detail. His usually calm demeanor carried just a hint of tension. The presence of the American Secret Service had turned the already secure castle into something resembling a fortress. The Queen, dressed in a vibrant pink coat and matching hat, stood by the window of her private study, watching the activity below. At 95 years old, she had met 13 American presidents, but there was something different about this visit. Perhaps it was the timing, coming just months after the tumultuous end of the Trump presidency, or maybe it was the personal connection she felt to Biden, having heard about his own experiences with loss and grief. "Your Majesty," Catherine said softly, approaching with the final briefing papers. "The president's motorcade has left the embassy. They'll arrive in precisely 23 minutes. The Queen turned from the window, her blue eyes sparkling with what those who knew her well recognized as genuine interest. "Tell me again about his family, Catherine. I want to make sure I get the details right." Catherine consulted her notes, though she had memorized every detail. "The president will be accompanied by the First Lady, Dr. Jill Biden. They've been married for 44 years. He has 4 grandchildren, and he's particularly close to them. His son Hunter has struggled with addiction, but is now clean. His daughter Ashley is a social worker. And of course," Catherine paused, knowing this next part was particularly significant to the Queen. "Yes, continue. His first wife Nylia and daughter Naomi died in a car accident in 1972, just after he was first elected to the Senate. His sons Beau and Hunter were critically injured but survived. Beau later died of brain cancer in 2015 while serving as Delaware's Attorney General." The Queen nodded slowly. She understood the weight of such loss. Her own experiences with grief, particularly the death of her husband Prince Philip just 2 months earlier, had given her a profound appreciation for others who had weathered similar storms. Meanwhile, in the black armored limousine racing through the countryside toward Windsor, President Biden was having his own moment of reflection. He stared out the window at the rolling English countryside, thinking about the conversation he was about to have. His foreign policy team had briefed him extensively on protocol and talking points, but he suspected this meeting would go far beyond standard diplomatic pleasantries. "Mr. President," said his chief of staff, Ron Klain, leaning forward from the seat behind him. "Remember, the Queen is quite informal once you get past the initial formalities. She's known for putting people at ease." Biden smiled, adjusting his tie. "Ron, I've been doing this for almost 50 years. But I'll admit, this one feels different." He looked at his wife, Jill, who was reviewing her own notes about royal protocol. "She's been on the throne since before I was born into politics. Think about everything she's seen, everyone she's met." Dr. Biden reached over and squeezed her husband's hand. "Just be yourself, Joe. That's what got you here." The motorcade was impressive even by presidential standards. 23 vehicles, including the presidential limousine, known as the Beast, rolled through the gates of Windsor Castle. Local police had closed roads for miles around, and snipers were positioned on rooftops throughout the area. But perhaps most remarkably, thousands of people had gathered along the route, waving American and British flags, creating a sea of red, white, and blue that stretched for miles. Back at the castle, the Queen's household staff was making final preparations. Mrs. Angela Kelly, the Queen's dresser and closest confidant, was ensuring every detail of Her Majesty's appearance was perfect. In the kitchen, Royal Chef Mark Flanagan was putting the finishing touches on what would become one of the most talked-about meals in recent diplomatic history. "The scones must be exactly the right temperature," Flanagan muttered to his sous chef, James. "Not too hot, not too cool. And the jam goes on first, then the cream. Always." James, who had been nervous all week about this particular tea service, nodded earnestly. "Chef, do you think the president knows about proper scone etiquette?" Flanagan smiled. "James, I have a feeling that by the end of today, protocol is going to be the least of anyone's concerns." He was more right than he could have imagined. In the castle's main corridor, footmen in full livery stood at attention while housemaids made sure every piece of silver gleamed. The atmosphere was electric, but there was also an underlying warmth that seemed to emanate from the Queen herself. She had insisted on using her personal china for tea, not the formal state service. She had chosen flowers from her own garden for the arrangements. These weren't the actions of someone going through diplomatic motions. "Ma'am," announced Equerry Major Tom White, "the presidential motorcade has entered the grounds." The Queen took a deep breath and made her way toward the main entrance. As she walked through the halls of her ancestral home, past portraits of kings and queens stretching back centuries, she was acutely aware of the historical significance of this moment. She had met with American presidents during the Cold War, through the fall of the Berlin Wall, after September 11th, and through numerous international crises. But this felt different. This felt like the beginning of something new. Outside, the motorcade came to a stop in the quadrangle. Secret Service agents emerged first, their eyes scanning every window, every doorway, every possible threat. Then, the presidential limousine's door opened, and President Biden stepped out onto the ancient stones of Windsor Castle. The first thing that struck him was the silence. Despite the presence of dozens of security personnel, staff members, and officials, there was an almost cathedral-like quiet that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the castle. Then, he looked up and saw her. Queen Elizabeth II stood in the doorway of her home, and for a moment, the most powerful man in the world felt like a schoolboy about to meet his teacher. But as their eyes met across the quadrangle, something unexpected happened. The Queen smiled, not the formal, practiced smile she used for state occasions, but a genuine, warm expression that seemed to say, "Welcome to my home." Dr. Biden emerged from the other side of the limousine, her own eyes wide as she took in the majesty of the 1,000-year-old castle. She had visited many impressive places as Second Lady, and now First Lady, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. The Queen began walking toward them, her steps surprisingly brisk for someone her age. Protocol dictated that she should wait for them to approach, but she had decided that today, protocol could take a back seat to hospitality. "Mr. President, Dr. Biden," she said as they met in the middle of the quadrangle, "welcome to Windsor Castle." Biden, who had been briefed on proper greeting protocol, found himself momentarily at a loss for words. Here was a woman who had ruled for longer than he had been alive, who had met with Churchill and Roosevelt, who had guided her nation through world wars and global changes, and she was greeting him like an old friend. "Your Majesty," he managed, executing what his protocol team would later describe as a perfectly acceptable bow. "Thank you for receiving us in your home." The Queen's eyes twinkled. "Mr. President, after the morning I've had dealing with parliamentary questions and estate matters, I'm rather looking forward to a proper conversation with someone who understands the complexities of leadership." Dr. Biden stepped forward, offering her own curtsy. "Your Majesty, it's an honor to meet you. I've heard so much about your commitment to education and literacy programs." "Ah, a fellow educator," the Queen replied, her interest clearly piqued. "I look forward to hearing about your work, Dr. Biden. Shall we go inside? I thought we might have tea in the oak drawing room. It has the most lovely view of the gardens." As they began walking toward the castle entrance, something remarkable happened. The formal atmosphere that typically surrounded such meetings began to dissolve. The Queen, who could have chosen to maintain strict protocol, instead began pointing out various aspects of the castle's architecture and history. That window there, she said, gesturing toward the upper floors, is where my great-great-grandmother Queen Victoria used to watch for Prince Albert's return from his rides. She said she could spot his horse from miles away. Biden found himself genuinely fascinated. Ma'am, if I may ask, what's it like living in a place with so much history? Every room must have stories. The Queen paused at the entrance and looked back at him with obvious approval. Mr. President, that's exactly the right question. Most visitors ask about the crown jewels or the staterooms. You're asking about the stories. I think we're going to get along very well. As they entered the castle, followed by a discreet entourage of staff and security personnel, none of them could have predicted how this simple tea would evolve into something far more significant than anyone had planned. The oak drawing room had been prepared to perfection, but it was clear that the Queen had chosen this particular space for its intimacy rather than its grandeur. Comfortable chairs were arranged around a low table, and afternoon sunlight streamed through tall windows that offered views of the carefully maintained gardens where horses grazed peacefully in the distance. "Please, sit wherever you're comfortable," the Queen said, gesturing toward the arrangement. "I find that the best conversations happen when people aren't worried about where they're supposed to be sitting." As they settled into their chairs, tea service began with the kind of precision that only comes from centuries of practice. But what happened next would surprise everyone present and create headlines around the world. The Queen leaned forward slightly and looked directly at President Biden. "Mr. President, before we discuss matters of state, I wonder if you might tell me about your granddaughter Naomi. I understand she was recently married, and I'd love to hear about the wedding." Biden's face lit up with the kind of joy that only grandparents understand. "Your Majesty, it was the most beautiful ceremony." She looked radiant, and my wife here, he gestured toward Dr. Biden, helped with all the planning. "It was held at our home in Rehoboth Beach." "How wonderful," the Queen replied, her own face brightening. "I've always believed that family celebrations are among life's greatest treasures. Tell me, was it a large affair or more intimate?" And just like that, the ice was broken. What was supposed to be a formal diplomatic tea had become a conversation between two people who understood the importance of family, the weight of responsibility, and the value of finding joy in life's simple pleasures. The staff members present would later describe the atmosphere as unlike anything they had ever experienced during a state visit. The usual tension and formality had been replaced by something that could only be described as genuine warmth. As the conversation continued, it became clear that this was going to be a meeting that none of them would ever forget. The tea service proceeded with remarkable informality, considering the circumstances. Royal footmen moved silently around the room, ensuring that cups remained filled and plates were replenished, but the conversation had taken on a life of its own that seemed to exist independent of protocol and procedure. "Your Majesty," Dr. Biden said, accepting a delicate china cup decorated with roses, "I have to ask about your educational initiatives. I've read about your literacy programs, and as a teacher myself, I'm fascinated by your approach to reaching different communities." The Queen's eyes brightened considerably. Throughout her long reign, she had championed numerous causes, but education had always held a special place in her heart. "Dr. Biden, I'm so glad you asked. You know, when I began my reign in 1952, literacy rates in some parts of the Commonwealth were quite concerning. I realized early on that a monarch's influence could extend far beyond ceremony and tradition." She set down her teacup and leaned forward with obvious enthusiasm. "We started with mobile libraries in remote areas of Wales and Scotland. Can you imagine? Librarians driving through mountain passes and crossing rivers just to bring books to children who had never seen a proper library." President Biden, who had been listening while enjoying what he would later describe as the best scone of his life, interjected, "Ma'am, that reminds me of something we're trying to do in rural America. Some of our communities are so isolated that children have to travel hours just to reach a school with a decent library." "Exactly," the Queen exclaimed, her usual reserved demeanor giving way to genuine passion. "Education shouldn't be a privilege determined by geography or circumstances. I've always believed that knowledge is the great equalizer. Catherine Morrison, who was taking discreet notes from her position near the window, had never seen the Queen so animated during a diplomatic meeting. The conversation was flowing with an ease that suggested these three people had known each other for years rather than having met just an hour earlier. Mr. President, the Queen continued, I understand you've faced significant opposition to some of your education proposals. How do you maintain momentum when progress seems slow? Biden paused, considering the question carefully. He had been asked similar questions by reporters and political analysts countless times, but something about the Queen's genuine interest made him want to give a more thoughtful answer than usual. Your Majesty, I've learned that lasting change happens one conversation at a time, one relationship at a time. When I was a young senator, I used to get frustrated with how slowly things moved. But over the years, I've come to understand that the most important work often happens away from cameras and headlines. The Queen nodded approvingly. I think you've discovered something that took me many years to learn. The public sees the ceremonies and state occasions, but the real work of leadership happens in quiet moments like this one. Meanwhile, outside the oak drawing room, the castle was buzzing with activity. Members of the press had been allowed into designated areas, and reporters from around the world were filing stories about the historic meeting. But they could only speculate about what was actually happening behind the closed doors. In the castle's communications center, Press Secretary Sarah Jenkins was fielding calls from news organizations wanting to know when they might expect official statements or photo opportunities. The original schedule had called for a brief tea followed by formal remarks, but it was becoming clear that the Queen and President were in no hurry to end their conversation. Sarah called Deputy Press Secretary Michael Chun. The BBC is asking if we can confirm the length of the meeting. They want to know if this is running longer than planned. Sarah looked at her watch and realized that the brief tea had already stretched to nearly 2 hours. Tell them that the Queen and President are engaged in substantive discussions, and will provide updates as appropriate. She smiled to herself. In the world of diplomacy, substantive discussions was code for they're actually enjoying themselves and don't want to stop talking. Back in the oak drawing room, the conversation had moved from education to a topic that would prove even more meaningful: loss and resilience. Mr. President, the Queen said softly, I hope you don't mind me mentioning this, but I was deeply moved by your speech about grief after my husband Philip passed away. Your letter was particularly touching. Biden's expression grew more serious. The death of Prince Philip in April 2021 had affected him more than he had expected. Perhaps it was because he understood the unique pain of losing someone who had been a constant companion through decades of public service. Your Majesty, I meant every word of that letter. When Jill and I heard the news, we both felt the loss personally, even though we had never met Prince Philip. There's something about a partnership that spans decades. It becomes part of who you are. Dr. Biden reached over and gently touched her husband's arm, a gesture that the Queen noticed and appreciated. Your Majesty, we've been married for 44 years, and I can't imagine navigating this life without Joe by my side. I can only imagine what it must be like to continue your duties after losing someone who was your partner for so many decades. The Queen was quiet for a moment, looking out the window toward the gardens where she and Philip had walked countless times over the years. When she spoke, her voice carried a depth of emotion that surprised everyone in the room. 73 years, she said simply. We were married for 73 years. People often ask me how I continue with my duties, how I find the strength to carry on. The truth is, I continue because Philip would expect me to. He understood duty in a way that few people do. She turned back to her guests, and there was something in her expression that spoke to a shared understanding of responsibility and sacrifice. But I've learned something important in these past months. Grief doesn't have to be the end of a story. It can be the beginning of a new chapter. Biden leaned forward, clearly moved by her words. Ma'am, you're absolutely right. After Beau died, I thought my political career was over. I couldn't imagine finding the energy or the purpose to continue. But then I realized that carrying on his ideals, continuing the work he believed in, was the best way to honor his memory. The Queen nodded. Your son would be very proud of you, Mr. President. I can see it in the way you speak about public service, the way you approach your responsibilities. That doesn't come from ambition or ego. That comes from love. Dr. Biden wiped away a tear that had formed in the corner of her eye. These were not the kinds of conversations that typically happen during state visits. This was something deeper, more human. Your Majesty, she said, may I ask you something personal? The Queen smiled. My dear, after this conversation, I think we're well beyond formal boundaries. Please ask whatever you'd like. How do you find joy now? How do you maintain hope when you've experienced so much loss? The Queen considered the question carefully. It wasn't something she had been asked directly before, and she found herself wanting to give an honest answer rather than a diplomatic one. Dr. Biden, I find joy in small things. In the horses in my stable, in letters from children, in the changing seasons in my gardens. But mostly, I find joy in moments like this one, when I'm reminded that despite all our differences in background and experience, we're all just human beings trying to make sense of this remarkable life. She paused and looked at both of her guests. And I find hope in leaders like your husband, who understand that true strength comes from compassion, not power. Biden was visibly moved by her words. Throughout his long political career, he had received praise from world leaders, but there was something about hearing those words from the Queen that carried special weight. Your Majesty, I have to tell you, this conversation has meant more to me than I can express. When my team briefed me for this visit, they prepared me for discussions about NATO, trade agreements, and international security. They didn't prepare me for this. The Queen laughed, a sound that filled the room with warmth. Mr. President, in my experience, the most important conversations are usually the ones no one prepares you for. Outside, the late afternoon sun was beginning to cast longer shadows across the castle grounds. What was supposed to have been a 45-minute tea had stretched to nearly 3 hours, and none of the participants seemed inclined to bring it to an end. Catherine Morrison caught the eye of Major White and nodded toward the door. The evening schedule would need to be adjusted, but it was clear that something special was happening in this room, and neither of them wanted to interrupt it unnecessarily. Ma'am, Catherine whispered to the Queen during a brief pause in conversation. Your evening engagements can be modified if you'd like to continue. The Queen looked at her secretary with obvious appreciation. Catherine, what would I do without you? Yes, please adjust the schedule. This is far too important to cut short. As the conversation resumed, it took another unexpected turn. The Queen, who rarely discussed her personal interests with visiting dignitaries, began telling stories about her horses and her passion for breeding and racing. Mr. President, do you ride? Biden smiled. I'm afraid not, Your Majesty. But I'd love to hear about your horses. I understand you're quite knowledgeable about breeding. The Queen's face lit up with enthusiasm. Oh my, where do I begin? I've been breeding racehorses for over 60 years. It's one of the few areas of my life where I can be completely myself, where I'm judged solely on my knowledge and instincts rather than my title. She gestured toward the window, where several horses could be seen grazing in the distance. Those are some of my favorites out there. That bay mare, Estimation, she's produced 3 winners this season. And the gray gelding next to her, that's Tactical, one of my most successful racehorses ever. Dr. Biden leaned forward with interest. Your Majesty, I can hear the passion in your voice when you talk about them. It must be wonderful to have something that brings you such genuine joy. It is, Dr. Biden. While I'm with my horses, I'm not the Queen. I'm just Elizabeth, someone who loves these magnificent animals and enjoys the challenge of breeding champions. Biden found himself genuinely fascinated by this side of the Queen that few people ever saw. Ma'am, would it be presumptuous to ask if we might see some of your horses? I mean, if time permits, and it wouldn't be too much trouble. The Queen's response surprised everyone in the room. Mr. President, nothing would give me greater pleasure. Shall we take a walk to the stables? And with that spontaneous suggestion, The carefully planned diplomatic tea was about to become something unprecedented in the history of Anglo-American relations. The suggestion to visit the stables sent a ripple of controlled panic through the security teams of both nations. Secret Service agents exchanged glances with royal protection officers, all of them mentally calculating the implications of moving the President of the United States and the Queen of England from the carefully secured drawing room to an outdoor location that hadn't been part of the original security plan. Chief Inspector Matthews approached Catherine Morrison with barely concealed concern. "Ma'am, we haven't done a full security sweep of the stable area for presidential protection protocols. This wasn't part of the agreed itinerary." Catherine looked at the Queen, who was already standing and moving toward the door with obvious excitement. "Inspector, I suggest you make it work. When Her Majesty gets an idea about her horses, there's really no point in arguing." Meanwhile, Secret Service agent Sarah Rodriguez was speaking urgently into her radio. "Command, POTUS is requesting movement to an unsecured location. We need immediate perimeter expansion and advanced team deployment to the castle stables." The response was swift and professional. Within minutes, additional security personnel were moving through the castle grounds, establishing new protection zones and communication points. But even as they worked to secure the area, many of them couldn't help but smile at the situation. In their years of protecting presidents and prime ministers, none of them had ever been asked to secure a stable visit for a diplomatic tea that had turned into an impromptu horse tour. As they prepared to leave the oak drawing room, Dr. Biden looked down at her outfit with concern. She was wearing an elegant dress and heels that were perfect for tea, but hardly appropriate for walking through stables. The Queen noticed her hesitation immediately. "My dear, don't worry about that for a moment. I have just the thing." She turned to her dresser, Mrs. Kelly, who had been standing discreetly nearby. "Angela, would you mind fetching a pair of my Wellington boots for Dr. Biden? I think we're about the same size." Mrs. Kelly, who had dressed the Queen for thousands of occasions over the years, had never received a request quite like this one. But she responded with professional efficiency. "Of course, Your Majesty. I'll bring a selection." As they waited for the boots, the Queen continued her preparations with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for her most beloved family gatherings. She removed her formal hat and handed it to her dresser, running her fingers through her silver hair with obvious relief. "Much better," she said with satisfaction. "One can't properly appreciate horses while worrying about keeping a hat in place." President Biden watched this transformation with fascination. In the space of a few minutes, he was seeing the Queen shed the formal trappings of monarchy and become someone much more relatable and human. It was a side of her that very few outsiders had ever witnessed. "Your Majesty," he said, "I have to admit, this is not how I imagined this day would go. But I'm grateful for it." The Queen smiled broadly. "Mr. President, I stopped trying to predict how days would unfold about 60 years ago. I've found that the best moments usually happen when you abandon the script." Mrs. Kelly returned with several pairs of Wellington boots, and Dr. Biden selected a pair in dark green. As she changed from her heels, she couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of the situation. "Joe," she said to her husband, "the girls back in Delaware are never going to believe this. I'm about to tour the Queen's stables in borrowed rain boots." Biden grinned. "Jill, I don't think anyone is going to believe any of this." As they prepared to leave, the Queen made one final preparation that would become one of the most talked about moments of the entire visit. She walked to a cabinet in the corner of the room and retrieved a well-worn wax jacket that had clearly seen many years of use. "This was Philip's," she said simply, putting on the jacket. "He always said it was the most practical thing in his wardrobe. I think he'd approve of its use today." The simple gesture carried enormous emotional weight. Here was the Queen, 95 years old and still grieving the loss of her husband, choosing to honor his memory by wearing his jacket while sharing one of her greatest passions with new friends. Dr. Biden felt tears spring to her eyes. "Your Majesty, that's beautiful. I'm sure he would be delighted to know you're still using it." "Oh, he'd probably complain that I'm not taking proper care of it," the Queen replied with a slight smile. Philip was very particular about his outdoor gear. The procession to the stables was unlike anything in the history of either royal protocol or presidential security. The Queen led the way with surprising energy, her Wellington boots splashing through small puddles left by the morning's rain. President Biden walked beside her, his own security detail maintaining a discreet but vigilant presence around them. Dr. Biden followed close behind, still adjusting to the unfamiliar sensation of walking in borrowed boots. The castle staff who witnessed this unprecedented parade would talk about it for years to come. Groundskeepers stopped their work to watch as the Queen of England and the President of the United States walked past like old friends heading out for a countryside stroll. "Your Majesty," Biden said as they approached the stable complex, "I have to ask, how often do you actually get to spend time with your horses without all the ceremony and protocol?" The Queen's answer revealed something profound about the isolation that comes with absolute power and responsibility. "Mr. President, probably not as often as I'd like. The demands of the crown mean that even my personal pleasures often become public events. But today feels different. Today feels like it's just for us." The stables at Windsor Castle were magnificent in their own right, a complex of buildings that had housed royal horses for centuries. The smell of hay and leather, the soft sounds of horses moving in their stalls, and the warm afternoon light filtering through the windows created an atmosphere of peaceful contentment that seemed worlds away from the formality of state dinners and diplomatic negotiations. "Oh, wonderful," the Queen exclaimed as they entered the main stable block. "The afternoon shift is here. Terry, would you come meet my guests?" Terry Pendry, the Queen's head groom, emerged from one of the stalls with obvious surprise. He had been told that the Queen might stop by with visitors, but he hadn't expected the visitors to include the President of the United States. "Your Majesty," he said, executing a quick bow before extending his hand to President Biden. "Mr. President, Dr. Biden, welcome to Windsor Stables. I'm Terry Pendry, head groom here." Biden shook his hand warmly. "Terry, it's a pleasure to meet you. I understand you know these horses as well as anyone." Terry smiled broadly. "Well, sir, I'd say Her Majesty knows them best, but I do my part. She's got an incredible eye for horses, the Queen does. Better than most professional trainers I've worked with." The Queen looked pleased by the compliment, but quickly redirected attention to the horses themselves. "Terry, is estimation in today? I'd love for the President and Dr. Biden to meet her." "She's right here, ma'am," Terry replied, leading them toward a stall where a beautiful bay mare was waiting with obvious curiosity about the unusual number of visitors. As they approached the stall, something magical happened. The Queen's entire demeanor transformed. The formal bearing and careful speech patterns that were second nature after 70 years of public life melted away, replaced by the unguarded enthusiasm of someone sharing their deepest passion. "Estimation, darling," she said softly, reaching out to stroke the mare's neck. "How are you today? These are my friends Joe and Jill. I wanted them to meet you." The horse responded to the Queen's voice and touch with obvious affection, nuzzling against her hand and making soft, nickering sounds. It was clear that this was a genuine relationship built over years of care and attention. Dr. Biden watched in wonder. "Your Majesty, she clearly adores you." "The feeling is entirely mutual," the Queen replied, continuing to stroke the horse's neck. "Estimation has been one of my most successful broodmares. She's produced 5 foals, and 3 of them have won significant races. But more than that, she's just a lovely soul. Aren't you, darling?" President Biden, who had approached horses only rarely in his life, found himself drawn to the obvious bond between the Queen and her animals. "Ma'am, may I ask how you developed such expertise with horses? This level of knowledge doesn't happen overnight." The Queen's answer provided insight into a side of her life that most people never considered. "Mr. President, I've been learning about horses since I was a child, but the real education began when I started breeding seriously in the 1960s. I read every book I could find, consulted with the best trainers in the country, and spent countless hours observing and learning from the horses themselves." She moved to the next stall, where a magnificent gray gelding was waiting. This is tactical. He's retired now, but in his racing days, he was extraordinary. Won several Group 1 races and earned quite a bit of prize money for the royal stables. As Terry opened Tactical's stall, the Queen entered without hesitation, continuing to speak as she examined the horse with practiced expertise. You see how he holds his head? That's confidence. And look at his legs, how he distributes his weight. Even in retirement, you can see the athlete he was. Biden found himself genuinely impressed by the Queen's knowledge and obvious passion. Your Majesty, this is remarkable. I had no idea you were so hands-on with the breeding and training. Oh, very much so, the Queen replied. I review all the breeding decisions, study the bloodlines, and follow the progress of every foal. It's one of the few areas of my life where I can make decisions based purely on merit and knowledge rather than tradition or protocol. Dr. Biden, who had been taking photos with her phone, paused to ask a question that revealed her educator's instincts. Your Majesty, do you keep records of all this? The breeding decisions, the outcomes, the lessons learned. The Queen's eyes lit up. Dr. Biden, you've hit upon one of my favorite subjects. I keep extensive records going back decades. Every breeding decision, every race result, every significant development. I sometimes think my racing and breeding records are more detailed than some state documents. Terry Pendry nodded enthusiastically. Dr. Biden, Her Majesty's record-keeping is legendary among horse professionals. She can tell you the bloodline of any horse going back 6 or 7 generations, and she remembers details about horses she bred 30 years ago. As they continued through the stables, meeting more horses and hearing more stories, it became clear that this impromptu visit was revealing aspects of the Queen's personality and intelligence that few people outside her inner circle had ever witnessed. Here was a woman who had mastered an incredibly complex field purely through passion and dedication, who had built a successful racing and breeding operation that competed at the highest levels of the sport. Your Majesty, Biden said as they approached the final stalls, I have to say, this has been one of the most enlightening experiences of my presidency. You've shown me a side of leadership and expertise that I never expected. The Queen smiled warmly. Mr. President, I think the best leaders are those who never stop learning, who maintain passions outside their official duties. It keeps us human. As they prepared to leave the stables, none of them could have predicted that their afternoon together was about to take yet another unexpected turn. As they prepared to leave the stables, the Queen paused at the entrance and looked back toward the paddocks where several horses were grazing in the late afternoon sun. The golden light cast everything in a warm glow that made the moment feel almost dreamlike. Mr. President, Dr. Biden, she said thoughtfully, would you mind if we took a slightly longer route back to the castle? There's something I'd like to show you. Both the Bidens immediately agreed, though their security details exchanged another round of concerned glances. The day had already gone far beyond any planned schedule, but it was becoming clear that something special was happening that transcended normal diplomatic protocols. The Queen led them down a gravel path that wound through the castle's private grounds, past carefully maintained gardens and ancient oak trees that had witnessed centuries of royal history. As they walked, she began sharing stories that offered unprecedented insights into her long reign. That tree there, she said, pointing to a massive oak whose trunk required several people holding hands to encircle it, was planted by my ancestor, George III. I used to climb it as a child during the war years when we lived here for safety. My sister Margaret and I would spend hours in its branches pretending to be lookouts for enemy aircraft. Dr. Biden stopped walking, clearly moved by the image of the future Queen as a young girl playing war games in a tree. Your Majesty, you lived here during World War II? I had no idea. Oh yes, the Queen replied, her voice taking on a nostalgic tone. My parents thought we'd be safer here than in London during the Blitz. Those were extraordinary times. Margaret and I would listen to the radio broadcasts about the war, but we didn't really understand the full magnitude of what was happening. We just knew that everyone seemed very serious and worried most of the time. President Biden, whose own father had served in World War II, was fascinated by this personal glimpse into history. "Ma'am, what do you remember most clearly from those years?" The Queen considered the question as they continued walking. "I think what struck me most was how the adults around us maintained hope despite everything. My father was dealing with enormous pressure. My mother was constantly worried about the safety of our people, but they never let Margaret and me feel that fear. They taught us that leadership meant carrying hope for others, even when you're not sure you have enough for yourself." They reached a small stone bench that offered a view across the Thames Valley, with rolling hills stretching to the horizon. The Queen sat down and gestured for a guest to join her. "I come here often to think," she said simply, "especially since Philip died. He loved this view. We would sit here together and discuss everything from family matters to affairs of state. He had such a clear way of seeing through to the heart of problems." Dr. Biden sat beside the Queen, struck by the intimacy of the moment. Here they were, sitting on a simple bench, having a conversation that felt more like friends sharing memories than a formal state visit. "Your Majesty, may I ask you something about marriage and partnership in public life?" The Queen nodded encouragingly. "Joe and I have been navigating this together for years now, but being First Lady is different from anything I've done before. How do you maintain your own identity while supporting your partner in such a public role?" The Queen's response revealed depths of wisdom earned through 7 decades of experience at the highest levels of public life. "Dr. Biden, that's one of the most intelligent questions anyone has ever asked me about royal life. The truth is, it's taken me many years to learn how to be myself while also being the Queen. For too long, I thought I had to choose between being Elizabeth and being the monarch. Philip helped me understand that I could be both." She looked out toward the horizon, clearly thinking about her late husband. "He never wanted me to diminish myself for the sake of protocol. When I was passionate about something, like the horses, he encouraged me to pursue that passion fully. He said that being authentic in some parts of my life would make me more effective in all parts of my life." Biden leaned forward, clearly interested in the conversation. "Ma'am, that sounds like wisdom that applies to any kind of leadership. I've struggled with the same thing throughout my career, trying to balance being Joe Biden with being Senator Biden or Vice President Biden, and now President Biden." "Exactly," the Queen replied. "The moment you start thinking that your title is more important than your character, you've lost something essential. The title is temporary, but character is permanent." As they sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, watching the sun sink lower in the sky, it was clear that this conversation had moved far beyond diplomacy into something more personal and profound. Catherine Morrison, who had been maintaining a discreet distance while staying within earshot, was frantically recalculating the evening schedule. The dinner with government officials was supposed to begin in 2 hours, but it seemed unlikely that anyone would want to interrupt this extraordinary dialogue. Meanwhile, back at the castle, the press corps was growing increasingly curious about the extended absence of their principals. Pool reporters had been told that the meeting was running long, but few had expected a simple tea to stretch into an entire afternoon. "Any word on when they'll return?" asked Rebecca Chun from the Washington Post, adjusting her camera equipment for what felt like the 100th time. Press Secretary Sarah Jenkins consulted her phone, reading a text message from Catherine Morrison. "The latest update I have is that they're engaged in substantive discussions and will return when they're finished." BBC correspondent James Morrison, no relation to Catherine, raised an eyebrow. "Sarah, that's the same update you gave us 2 hours ago. Are they still in the castle?" Sarah smiled diplomatically. "James, what I can tell you is that both principals are safe, secure, and apparently very much enjoying their conversation." Back at the bench, the Queen had begun sharing insights about leadership that would influence Biden's thinking about his presidency for years to come. "Mr. President," she said, "in my experience, the most important quality in a leader is not intelligence or charisma or even vision, though all of those matter. The most important quality is constancy." "Constancy?" Biden asked. "Yes, the ability to remain steady and reliable even when everything around you is changing or falling apart." People need to know that their leaders will be there, that they won't abandon their post when things get difficult. She paused, collecting her thoughts. I've seen 13 British prime ministers come and go during my reign. Some were brilliant, some were less so, but the ones I respected most were those who understood that leadership is about service, not personal advancement. Dr. Biden was taking mental notes, knowing that this conversation was providing insights that no briefing book could offer. Your Majesty, how do you maintain that constancy over such a long period? How do you avoid becoming cynical or losing hope? The Queen's answer was perhaps the most revealing thing she said all day. Dr. Biden, I stay connected to ordinary people and ordinary moments. When I visit schools or hospitals or community centers, I'm reminded why the work matters. When I'm with my horses or my dogs, I remember what brings me joy. And when I sit in places like this one, I remember that I'm part of something much larger than myself. She gestured toward the ancient landscape around them. This land, these people, this continuity of service, it's bigger than any individual monarch or president. We're just temporary custodians of something precious. Biden was quiet for a long moment, clearly moved by her words. When he spoke, his voice carried an emotion that surprised even him. Your Majesty, I want you to know that this conversation has meant more to me than any foreign policy briefing or strategic discussion I've had since taking office. You've reminded me why I ran for president in the first place. The Queen smiled warmly. Mr. President, that's very kind of you to say, but I suspect you never really forgot why you ran. Sometimes we just need someone to help us remember what we already know in our hearts. As the sun continued to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, the Queen made a suggestion that would create one of the most memorable moments of the entire visit. Mr. President, Dr. Biden, I wonder if you might like to see the sunset from the Round Tower? It's quite a climb, but the view is spectacular, and I think it would be a fitting way to end our afternoon together. The Round Tower, the oldest part of Windsor Castle and its most iconic feature, rose dramatically from the center of the castle complex. The idea of a 95-year-old queen leading the President of the United States up the ancient stone steps for sunset views was so unexpected, so spontaneously genuine, that both Bidens immediately agreed. As they began walking back toward the castle, all three of them seemed to understand that their afternoon together was drawing to a close, but that something significant had been accomplished. They had moved beyond the formal requirements of diplomacy into genuine friendship and mutual respect. Your Majesty, Dr. Biden said as they approached the Round Tower, I want to thank you for sharing so much of yourself with us today. This has been extraordinary. My dear, the Queen replied, the pleasure has been entirely mine. It's rare that I get to have such honest, thoughtful conversations with fellow public servants. You've both reminded me why I still love this work after all these years. As they began climbing the worn stone steps of the Round Tower, none of them could have predicted that their ascent would lead to a moment that would be remembered and talked about for decades to come. The most powerful man in the world and the longest reigning monarch in British history were about to share a sunset that would symbolize the enduring strength of the special relationship between their two nations. But more than that, they were about to discover that sometimes the most important diplomatic breakthroughs happen not in formal negotiations or carefully scripted meetings, but in quiet moments of human connection between leaders who understand the weight of responsibility and the value of friendship. The climb to the top of the Round Tower was more challenging than anyone had anticipated, especially for the Queen, who had insisted on leading the way despite the protests of both security teams. The ancient stone steps, worn smooth by nearly 1,000 years of royal feet, spiraled upward through increasingly narrow passages that had never been designed for modern security protocols. Secret Service agent Rodriguez spoke urgently into a radio as they climbed. Command, this is Vanguard. POTUS is ascending an 11th century tower with limited exit strategies and no advanced security sweep. Recommend immediate helicopter standby. Behind her, Royal Protection Officer Matthews was having similar concerns. Control, this is Windsor 1. The Queen is insisting on completing the tower ascent. Medical team should be standing by. But ahead of them, the Queen climbed with determination that belied her 95 years, pausing occasionally to point out historical features of the tower to her guests. This section was rebuilt by Edward III in the 14th century, she said, not even slightly out of breath. The walls are over 12 feet thick in some places. During the Civil War, parliamentary forces tried to breach them with cannons, but they barely made a dent. President Biden, who was beginning to feel the strain of the climb, marveled at her energy. "Your Majesty, I have to ask, how often do you make this climb?" The Queen paused and turned back with a mischievous smile. "Mr. President, not as often as I used to, but more often than my staff would prefer. There's something about being up high that helps me think clearly about problems." Dr. Biden, who was grateful for the pause, looked around at the ancient stonework surrounding them. "Your Majesty, the history in these walls is incredible. To think of all the monarchs who have climbed these same steps." "Oh yes," the Queen replied, resuming their ascent. "My father used to bring me here during the war to show me the view and teach me about responsibility. He said that from the top, you could see the whole realm you were sworn to protect, and it helped you remember what you were working for." As they neared the top of the tower, natural light began filtering down from above, and the sound of wind grew stronger. The Queen quickened her pace slightly, clearly eager to share the view that had inspired her for so many decades. Finally, they emerged onto the tower's roof, and both Bidens stopped in amazement. The view was absolutely breathtaking. From this height, they could see for miles in every direction. The Thames winding through the countryside, the town of Windsor spread out below, and in the distance, the spires of London rising through the evening haze. But it was the sunset that truly took their breath away. The sun was sinking toward the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange, pink, and gold that seemed to set the entire landscape on fire. The Queen moved to the eastern parapet and gestured for her guests to join her. "This," she said simply, "is why I still love this job." They stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, each lost in their own thoughts as they watched one of nature's most beautiful displays unfold before them. The wind carried the sounds of the countryside below, horses neighing in distant pastures, church bells marking the evening hour, the faint rumble of traffic on roads that had been ancient when the tower was built. Dr. Biden was the first to speak. "Your Majesty, this is magical. I understand now why you wanted to share this with us." The Queen nodded, her eyes still fixed on the horizon. "Dr. Biden, I've watched sunsets from this tower during some of the most difficult moments of my reign. During the Suez Crisis, during the troubles in Northern Ireland, after Princess Diana died, during the pandemic. This view reminds me that despite all our human struggles and conflicts, there's something larger and more beautiful than our individual problems." President Biden moved closer to the Queen, struck by the profound symbolism of the moment. Here he was, standing with the longest reigning monarch in British history, watching the sun set over a kingdom she had served for 7 decades, sharing insights that no briefing book could provide. "Your Majesty," he said quietly, "I want you to know that this day has changed my perspective on leadership in ways I'm still processing. Your example of service, your dedication to something larger than yourself, your ability to find joy and meaning even after experiencing tremendous loss, it's inspiring." The Queen turned from a view to look at him directly. "Mr. President, leadership is not about the power you hold or the decisions you make in isolation. It's about understanding that you're part of a continuum, that the work you do today will affect generations you'll never meet." She gestured toward the landscape below. "Every decision I've made as Queen, every tradition I've maintained or changed, every relationship I've built with world leaders like you, it's all part of preparing the way for those who come after me. That's what makes the sacrifice worthwhile." As the sun sank lower, the Queen began sharing what would prove to be the most important insights of their entire meeting. "Mr. President, you're leading your nation during a time of great division and uncertainty. I watched America go through difficult periods before, but I've also watched it emerge stronger each time. The key is to remember that leadership is not about winning every battle, but about maintaining faith in your people and your principles. Biden listened intently, knowing that he was receiving wisdom from someone who had navigated more political crises and international challenges than perhaps any leader in modern history. Ma'am, how do you maintain that faith when everything seems to be falling apart? When people question your every decision, when the problems seem bigger than any individual's ability to solve them. The Queen's answer came from 7 decades of experience managing the pressures of absolute responsibility. Mr. President, I've learned that the moment you start governing for approval ratings or headlines, you've lost your way. You must govern for history, for the long-term good of your people, even when they can't see it in the moment. She paused, watching as the sun touched the horizon. And you must remember that failure is not falling down, it's staying down. Every great leader I've known has faced moments of doubt, moments when they wondered if they were equal to the task. The measure of their greatness was not whether they had those moments, but whether they found the strength to continue despite them. Dr. Biden, who had been quietly observing this exchange, asked a question that revealed her deep understanding of the personal costs of public service. Your Majesty, how do you balance the needs of your role with the needs of your family? How do you maintain personal relationships when your life belongs to the public? The Queen's response was perhaps the most personal thing she shared all day. Dr. Biden, that's the eternal struggle of public service. I've made mistakes, I've missed important family moments, I've sometimes put duty before the people I love most. Philip understood that better than anyone, and he sacrificed much of his own ambitions to support mine. She looked at both Bidens with obvious emotion. But I've also learned that the people who truly love you will understand that your service comes from love for something larger than yourself. And if you're fortunate enough to find a partner who shares that understanding, like Philip was for me, or like Dr. Biden is for you, then the sacrifice becomes bearable. As the sun finally disappeared below the horizon, leaving the sky painted in deep purples and golds, the Queen made a gesture that surprised everyone present. She removed a small pin from her jacket, a piece of jewelry that had clearly been with her for many years. Mr. President, she said, offering the pin to Biden, this belonged to my father, King George VI. He wore it during some of the most difficult days of World War II. I'd like you to have it as a reminder that leadership requires courage, but courage is something we can share with one another. Biden was visibly moved as he accepted the pin, understanding the extraordinary personal and historical significance of the gift. Your Majesty, I'm deeply honored. I'll treasure this always. And, Dr. Biden, the Queen continued, removing a small brooch from her other lapel. This was my mother's. She wore it when she visited bombed areas during the Blitz, bringing comfort to families who had lost everything. I hope it will remind you that the role of a leader's spouse is not to stand in the shadows, but to shine light where it's needed most. Dr. Biden accepted the brooch with tears in her eyes, understanding that she was receiving not just a piece of jewelry, but a piece of royal history and a symbol of the Queen's confidence in her. As darkness settled over the countryside and lights began to twinkle in the town below, the three of them stood together on the ancient tower, sharing a moment of connection that transcended politics, nationality, and protocol. Your Majesty, Biden said finally, how do we properly thank you for a day like this? This goes so far beyond diplomacy or state visits. You've given us something precious. The Queen smiled, and in the gathering darkness, her expression carried all the warmth and wisdom of someone who had lived through nearly a century of extraordinary history. Mr. President, Dr. Biden, the gift has been mutual. You've reminded an old woman that the work of leadership is still worth doing, that there are still people willing to serve something larger than themselves. That's a gift I'll treasure. As they began the careful descent down the ancient spiral staircase, all three of them understood that something remarkable had occurred. What had begun as a routine diplomatic meeting had evolved into a profound human connection that would influence their thinking and their work for years to come. The following morning, headlines around the world would struggle to capture the significance of what had happened at Windsor Castle. The formal diplomatic communiques would mention trade agreements and security cooperation, but they would miss the real story, that sometimes the most important diplomatic breakthroughs happen not in conference rooms or formal negotiations, but in quiet moments of genuine human connection between leaders who understand both the burden and the privilege of service. Years later, when historians would analyze the Biden presidency and the final years of Queen Elizabeth II's reign, they would identify their afternoon at Windsor Castle as a turning point, a moment when two leaders found renewed purpose and strength in their shared commitment to something larger than themselves. But on that evening in June 2021, as they made their way back through the castle's ancient halls, past portraits of kings and queens stretching back through centuries, they were simply three people who had discovered the profound power of honest conversation, mutual respect, and genuine friendship. The Queen had given them more than afternoon tea and a tour of her stables. She had given them a masterclass in leadership, a glimpse into the meaning of true service, and a reminder that the highest calling of any leader is not to acquire power, but to use whatever power they have in service of others. As President and Mrs. Biden prepared to leave Windsor Castle that evening, they carried with them not just the formal agreements and diplomatic protocols that would be recorded in official documents, but something far more valuable: the wisdom, example, and friendship of a remarkable woman who had dedicated her entire life to something larger than herself. The Queen, standing in the doorway of her home as their motorcade disappeared into the night, watched them go with the satisfaction of someone who had shared not just her knowledge and experience, but her deepest convictions about the meaning and purpose of leadership in a complex and challenging world.